You know the Dauntless dive bomber, the legendary aircraft that helped to turn the tide at Midway and pounded Japanese targets all over the Pacific in World War II. But in this video, featuring stunning visuals and interviews with experts and pilots of the SBD, we will cover some things that you may not know, the fascinating and important details that history can often overlook. So without further ado, let's jump into 5 things you never knew about the SBD Dauntless. Before we get into these unknown facts about the SBD Dauntless, let me tell you how I'm able to afford to travel and get the great commentary that you guys are about to see. It's because, technically, I'm a lord. Thanks to this video's sponsor, Established Titles, I was able to officially become Lord TJ. That's right, this cool project actually allows you to get or give the traditional Scottish titles of Lord or Lady by buying a small plot of land in Scotland. But it is even cooler than that. In addition to owning at least 1 square foot of Scottish land and a classy frame certificate, each Established Titles purchase also helps to preserve the natural woodlands of Scotland, and they even plant a tree with every order. Here you'll get an official plot number where you can see and even visit your exact plot of land. And no pressure, but if you get yours soon, you can probably get a plot right next to mine. So don't wait. If you are looking for a great last-minute gift or are wanting to do something outside of the box for a history fan, go to establishedtitles.com/TJ3 and use code TJ3 for 10% off. Thanks again to Established Titles, and without further ado, enjoy. To begin our list for today, we will take a look at some interesting aspects of the wings of the Dauntless that many people are not aware of. Now, most of those who have seen the SBD before have noticed its unique dive flaps on the wings. They stand out and are an extremely recognizable feature of this aircraft. And you also probably know that these were used for landing and for dive bombing attacks. But what you may not know is the story behind their design, specifically the holes in the flaps. These would actually come about in the design after a significant problem was discovered. It was found that the SBD was a good design, but when it was taken into an attacking dive and the flaps were opened, the airflow would then cause the tail of the SBD to shake violently. Not only would this cause any bombing attacks to be inaccurate, but it would also likely rip off the tail of the airframe if the dive work continued. So obviously, this was a major issue that had to be resolved. Fortunately, the designers of the SBD would get some help from a group of brilliant engineers.
When they first designed the airplane that was to become the SBD, it was the Northrop BT-1. And the dive brakes were solid. They didn't have the holes in them. And they went into a dive, and they would continually during the testing would increase the dive angle to the point where they were at the 70-degree dive. When they put the dive brakes out, where they were still solid, the tail started buffeting. If you read the account of the engineers who flew in the back and watched it, that horizontal stabilizer was going up and down 2 feet. So there was a lot of buffeting going on back there. So they wrestled with that question, is how do we decrease that buffeting, which is going to tear the tail off the airplane? And they got in contact with what was the precursor of NASA, called NACA. And they said, well, what do you think about this? And they said, have you tried drilling holes in the flaps? So they started experimenting, and they drilled bigger and bigger holes, half the flap, the full flap, quarter of the flap. And they finally realized that full flap, 3-inch diameter holes were the perfect size to where you could slow the aircraft down, but still not cause drag, and only lose about 5% of your airspeed when you're landing aboard a carrier.
After these holes in the flaps were added, the shaking stopped and the dive was completely stabilized. It was then able to execute its dives and hit targets with deadly accuracy. But this interesting story is not the only thing that makes the wings of the Dauntless unique. You might have also noticed that the wings on the SBD do not fold. This is very unusual for a Navy aircraft during this time. If you think about any of the other carrier-based US planes of this era, like the Wildcat, Corsair, or the Avenger, you can see that nearly all of them have folding wings for storage. But there was a planned reason behind this decision.
It did not have folding wings, even though at the time they were making Navy airplanes with folding wings. But to add the folding wings, they would have added more weight to make them stronger, and they did not want to add that weight to the airplane.
The fold mechanism on an airplane is very heavy. You have to have very big pieces of metal where they come together and lock. And you have to have all the hydraulic piping and the hydraulic mechanisms to make the wings move. That's very heavy. So they decided with the SBD to remove that to save the weight because they wanted to carry the maximum bomb load. And with the wing the way it's designed, they weren't really compromising all that much space-wise.
In the end, this clearly proved to be a good design choice, as the power and stability of the SBD were just right. And although both of these design features of the SBD were unusual for the time, they both allowed the Dauntless to fill the role that the US needed flawlessly in World War II. Up next, we will dive, pun intended, into the first actual bombing kill that the SBD Dauntless is credited with. Shockingly, this event actually occurred on December 10th of 1941, just 3 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and was a somewhat unusual target for the SBD, a Japanese submarine. Fortunately, one of our SBD experts interviewed for this video offered some great insight into this historic mission.
Well, luckily we have the pilot who flew that attack. His name was Clarence Dickinson, and he wrote a book in 1942. And he describes how he found the submarine, how he climbed to attack it, and how he attacked it.
In addition, Peter Haig from Airbase, Georgia also had an original copy of the 1942 book, The Flying Guns, written by Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson. And in a move of questionable judgment on his part, he actually allowed me to borrow the copy of his 80-year-old book so that we could read Lieutenant Dickinson's story for ourselves. While stationed on board the USS Enterprise just after the Day of Infamy, he writes, "On Wednesday, following that Sunday attack on Pearl Harbor, the morning scouting flight picked up 3 or 4 submarines on the surface. 3 or 4 seen in that area covered by the scouting flight logically meant that there were an awful lot of Jap submarines around. So, about 11:30 in the morning of December 10th, Admiral Halsey decided to send 3 planes to each place where a submarine had been sighted. I was detailed to make this flight. With a new tail gunner recently assigned to him, Dickinson takes us through what happened as he flew rectangles over the Pacific north of Hawaii, scanning for Japanese submarines. I could see at least 25 miles in any direction, possibly 30 miles. Just as I reached the north corner of my rectangle, lo and behold, way over to the northeast, about 15 or 18 miles away, there was a great big submarine running on the surface. It was pushing to the northeast just as fast as it could go. It was obviously a submarine, but looked to me to be the biggest I had ever seen. I talked to the carrier immediately. This is Sail 4, have sighted submarine, am attacking. The carrier acknowledged my message. I was already headed for the sub. I was about 800 feet off the water then, and to make a good dive bombing attack, I would have to climb to at least 5,000 or 6,000 feet. So I started climbing. Unfortunately for Dickinson, this meant that he would have to have a long approach to the sub, which meant that it could very well have time to fire at him and possibly even submerge. In addition, he had to mechanically arm the bomb before the attack. If this task were not completed by the pilot, then they would drop a dud, which was the ultimate waste of a bombing run. During these missions, it was standard protocol for the tail gunner to double check that the pilot had indeed armed the bomb with a simple "Is the bomb armed?" over the radio to ensure that this mistake was avoided. This led to an interesting conversation between Lieutenant Dickinson and his radio man and gunner, a lad named Merritt. He continues, "Those anti-aircraft bursts were giving me just a touch of a headache. There wasn't a great deal of danger in them, but they were annoying. I was climbing as hard as I could, and then young Merritt called out over the radio, 'Is the bomb armed, Mr. Dickinson?' I was busy at my cockpit, so in that second I did not respond. Mr. Dickinson, is the bomb armed? I feel sure I must have said yes a couple of times, but this kid in the back of me wasn't going to have a failure on his hands. I was climbing and estimating the situation every instant. The Japs were shooting, Merritt was prompting. Be sure the bomb is armed. Look here, I said. The bomb is armed. For God's sake, relax. Maybe we can get this submarine. Take my word for it, the bomb is armed. A few moments later, Dickinson and Merritt closed in on the Japanese sub. I suppose the Japs' 2 deck guns had fired at least 25 shells at me. I had him in my sight for almost 8 minutes, yet he made no attempt to submerge. All he was doing was turning to the right a few degrees. Obviously, there was something wrong with him. He had been bombed once before that day. The plane from our carrier that had found him at 6 o'clock in the morning had dropped a bomb fairly close to him, so I believed that he could not submerge. I can't imagine a skipper in his right mind staying on the surface to fight a plane rather than diving. Even when I was 3 or 4 minutes away, in good working order, he might have submerged easily. He did not, so I believe that he had been previously damaged. I was measuring the sub's course, measuring my height, and getting nicely set when my gunner spoke again. Is the bomb armed, Mr. Dickinson? This time I said, rather gently I think, yes. Then I dove. I had a pretty good dive. All the way down I could see those heathens still shooting. In the next few moments, Lieutenant Dickinson barreled downward at the target and released his bomb. As he pulled out of the attack, he saw that the bomb landed right next to the sub, an ideal location for his payload to strike. He and his radio man looked down and saw that the submarine had stopped forward motion. Then, a few moments later, she began to list and sank beneath the waves. There was a good deal of oil and debris that floated to the surface shortly after, confirming that she was likely destroyed. Lieutenant Dickinson and his radio man would thereafter return to the USS Enterprise, where they told the Admiral of their strike. This would officially go down as the first naval vessel sank by the SBD less than 3 days after the United States officially entered the war. At number 3, we will actually go to an unknown blip on the service record that was actually a less than stellar performance for the SBD. And, shockingly enough, this would occur at the famous Battle of Midway. Now, in this famous clash, many are aware of the successes of the Dauntless, as the Navy bombers destroyed the Japanese carriers. Their victories were undoubtedly what won the great battle. But what many people are not aware of is that another group of SBDs participated in Midway, and did not see the same level of success. This would be the Marine SBDs of VMSB 241, which was stationed at Midway Island. Before any of the Navy bombers would strike, these bombers were scrambled early on June 4th, and followed behind the B-26s and Avengers that attacked first. Of these 27 Marine bombers that participated in this early strike, 16 of them were SBDs. There were 2 key differences in this attack, however, that led to drastically different results than the later Navy attacks that won the battle. The first was that in this attack, air interceptors were ready and were sent to intercept the Marine aircraft well before the bombers could strike. As they began to approach their target, they were swarmed by Japanese fighters, which dealt a heavy blow and shot down many of their aircraft. The second key difference would be that these Marines had just recently transitioned into the SBD and had not been adequately trained in dive bombing tactics. Thus, they would instead attempt to utilize the glide bombing attack method, which was easier to execute, but left them more vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft fire as the attack run was much longer and slower. Because of this, 8 of the 16 SBDs from VMSB 241 would be shot down, including their flight leader, Major Lofton Henderson, who was killed in this attack. A bonus fact here is that Major Henderson, who was awarded the Navy Cross for leading this strike, was one of the oldest pilots that I have seen who was killed in action here, as he was 39 years old when he led his flight to attack the Japanese fleet. Overall, the differences in the attack strategy and circumstances for these Marine SBDs actually led to a vastly different outcome in the Battle of Midway, and show us just how easily things could have gone different in this iconic battle. Up next, we will look at how the SBD was used in a theater of war that it is often not associated with, in Europe and North Africa. When many people think of the Dauntless, they immediately envision its stories and accomplishments in the Pacific. And while this is certainly where it made its greatest contributions, it was in fact used in small numbers on the other side of the world against the Germans. This would occur in a few different locations and situations. The first would come in 1942 as part of Operation Torch, which was the Allied invasions of North Africa. Here, they flew support from carriers in the Mediterranean like the USS Ranger. In this battle, the SBD would strike targets all around the coast, specifically enemy emplacements on the shore, as well as some naval targets including the Vichy French battleship Jean Bart. 11 months later, these same SBDs would also be used to attack German shipping around Norway. Another usage of the SBD in the European theater that often gets overlooked is in a relatively obscure force in World War II, the Free French Air Force. The Free French claimed to be the rightful government of France in opposition to Nazi Germany's puppet government. Led by Charles de Gaulle, this force was actually given around 80 SBDs to aid in their efforts and contribute to the war. For these Allied forces, they would utilize the SBD in a variety of roles and would primarily see combat in ground-based operations over southern France. Here, they would fight valiantly, but would quickly learn just how deadly German flak could be and saw high losses from anti-aircraft fire. Finally, at number 1, we will look at just how deadly the SBD dive bomber was, as a fighter. Although it was designed, built, and utilized as a dive bomber, the SBD was also no sitting duck in the air. On multiple occasions, SBD pilots actually shot down agile Japanese fighters, including one particular occasion in which Swede Vedesa would bring down 3 Mitsubishi Zeros, the most feared fighter in the Pacific at this time.
Once it dropped its bombs, it was a pretty good fighter. It has 2 50 caliber machine guns up on the nose that fire between the propeller blades as the propeller is going around. It has a gear up there with an electric switch. And as the propeller starts to go in front of the gun, the switch turns the gun off. When the propeller goes past the gun, it turns the guns back on. And it was quite maneuverable. The records that I have read indicate that 100 of these were shot down by Japanese airplanes. Many others were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, but 100 by Japanese airplanes. But it shot down 105 Japanese airplanes. So it actually had a positive ratio in dogfights.
So they tried to use it as an adjunct fighter. So at Coral Sea, they put the SBDs out there with the idea of when the Japanese attack and we have their torpedo planes coming in, the fighters are going to be dealing up high with the dive bombers. We'll use the SBD to shoot down the torpedo bombers. But the reason why the SBD would have been a good dogfighter is, look at the size of that wing. That's a lot of lift on that wing vice the Japanese Zero. So this means that at a given weight, he can turn quicker than the Japanese Zero can.
So, knowing this, what exactly would an SBD pilot need to do in a dogfight to take down an advanced fighter like the Japanese Zero? Let's find out.
So what you would have is, let's say for example, your Zero is diving down here to attack, all right? The first thing you're going to do is break into him to spoil his firing solution. Now, he's going really fast. You're going not quite so fast, but you with that wing can turn tighter than he can. So you're going to do what the fighter guys call kick him outside of the turn. The fighter, he's got 3 options. As you start your turn, you've spoiled his firing solution. He's going to duck his nose if he's smart, accelerate, get away, climb up, and attack again. If he's a really good pilot, what he's going to do is put the nose into the vertical and use what the fighter guys call God's G to use that to get inside of his turn and come back and re-attack. But if it's an inexperienced Japanese pilot, as soon as I break, I'm going to watch him go try to match my radius of turn. I'm going to spit him out the other side. So if I see him getting spit out, I can reverse quickly, and now I can get a snapshot. I can get a quick burp burp out on him. Maybe hit him, but definitely spoil his plans for the day. So now he's got to react to, I went from a defensive position to a neutral position to an offensive position really quick if the guy is not that good.
Because of these factors, the SBD would actually go on to be successfully used as an air-to-air fighter on multiple occasions. Pilots like Swede Vedesa would utilize this to score kills in their bombers when the opportunity presented itself. In his story in particular, he would actually be transferred to the F4F Wildcat after this famous mission, since he had clearly shown he had the skill set of a dogfighter. He would go on to finish the war with 10 kills and would be the only Navy service member awarded the Navy Cross in both the SBD dive bomber and the F4F Wildcat fighter. Now, I actually have one more bonus fact on the SBD for you guys, quite possibly the best of them all. I am thrilled to announce that for Veterans Day of 2022, I will be unveiling the greatest project of my career. We will get the opportunity to sit down with an actual World War II SBD veteran, relive his story, and get to follow him as he goes back into an SBD Dauntless for the first time in 79 years. Enjoy this sneak peek and get excited.
This flight I'm going to do next week is probably the pinnacle of my entire aviation career. The SBD means a lot to me. It's what the airplane that, and the story of Midway that from a very early age said, I'm going to be a naval aviator. So when I fly these airplanes a lot, I look out at the wings or I look across the nose and I say, I wonder what it was like being there at Midway, at Guadalcanal, at Santa Cruz, looking down, seeing the Japanese fleet, realizing I'm going into battle. If I could just have 1 second of what that felt like. And now I'm going to fly a guy who was actually there. So this is an opportunity that it will never come to me again. And I cannot tell you how honored I am to get to fly with a guy who was there and lived it. My only hope is that I'm as good a pilot as he deserves.
A huge thanks again to the Commemorative Air Force and Airbase Georgia for supporting me in making this video. Please check out what they do at the links below and go see some of their beautiful warbirds. Make sure to comment what plane I should cover next, and please consider subscribing.